like to thank for sponsoring today's class, Helen Daniels. And life is funny. Batya and her female cousins, the day after the Seder, went down to Eilat. And I went to pick her up at the train station today. They flew down, but she took the train from the airport. And we drove one of my nieces home.
And his stuff in his car. How do you like that one?
Please mute. Anyway, driving David's daughter home, they live in Beit HaKerem, and so that's near Mount Herzl. And as we continued toward our place, we passed Gan Sacher. And it reminded me, these two spots together, of a story that I'm sure I have told before, but I listened to it for 26 years at school in Toronto, told by the head of the school, and it bears repeating. So one year, Rabbi Sofer was in Israel on Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, and he went to Har Herzl, where so many people go to the various military cemeteries on Yom HaZikaron, the day before Yom HaAtzmaut. And his eyes focused on one family. And he saw that together with children and what appeared to be the man's wife, that the father was in particular weeping. The family left, and he went over to the grave, and he saw that it was a son who had been killed 10 years previously. So he understood the weeping. The next day, he goes to Gan Sacher, where so many go for barbecues and singing and dancing. And just by coincidence, he sees that same family and he recognizes the father. And he couldn't help himself. And he went up to him and said, I hope you don't mind, but I have to ask you. I saw you just yesterday weeping. And here today, I see you dancing with such joy. And the father answered him, as you can guess, he said, to make my son's death have meaning and give us the opportunity to go on, I have to dance.
Wow.
I want to begin by asking you for your take on this pasuk from Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. For that is the end of every man, and the living shall lay it to his heart. And the commentators tell us that Kohelet is suggesting that you have to choose between the two, whether it's going to be a home where it is festive or whether it is going to be a home of mourning. Any reactions to that statement? The either or?
I think the visit to the mourning is a lot more meaningful. The people who are happy, they are happy. But the people who are mourning really need comfort. And so it makes a lot more sense to me.
Okay, so you're appreciating why, if you have to make the choice, and there are laws to that effect, why you would go. Anybody else?
Oh, bracha, I don't think they're mutually exclusive at all. I think that you can mourn and be happy depending on the situation, and that the two, that you need both, that one isn't strong enough, one doesn't compel oneself enough without the other.
Yeah, Merle, that is the thrust of my reaction, and also, in fact, the unity of these 2 days. I want to say very different days, and they are, but they certainly go together.
But the sentence doesn't say betov lalechet. It means that you have to choose from the first 2 words.
Well, according to him, but we have a right to react and perhaps not totally agree, even though if it's something very tangible, that maybe you have to go to a funeral instead of a wedding, okay. I bring this only to get us into our subject today. It is still Pesach, but already in the air here, there is a feeling that comes with the approaching national days of commemoration. Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, and Yom HaAtzmaut. There are flags already raised on public buildings, apartment balconies, and even private cars. And as radio and TV interviews talk with Holocaust survivors and experts about the horrors of our past and our collective memory, we will also see posters announcing concerts and other celebrations for Israel's 74th. Educator Alex Israel, just by coincidence, of the Pardes Institute here, refers to these 3 days, which are often referred to actually as Israel's contemporary high holidays, and he describes them: reflection, sorrow, and celebration mix in an impossible mosaic as tears of loss merge with tears and songs of happiness. I'm going to read it one more time. Reflection, sorrow, and celebration mix in an impossible mosaic as tears of loss merge with tears and songs of happiness. And there has evolved a tradition here to make something of this notion of the contemporary high holidays. 2 examples. There are some who have suggested that just like we have Aseret Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days of repentance between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaAtzmaut, we should also have days of reflection and cheshbon hanefesh. Yes, individually, but certainly as a nation. If we're celebrating, it's not just a free-for-all, it's a meaningful joy. I think, and would like to delve into 2 other mosaics as we approach this time of year. One, the diversity of our nation's citizens. And secondly, the mosaic, the mix of the old and new in our national symbols. Last week, we were inspired by Roy Klein, Zichrono Livracha, who saved his unit by jumping on that horrific grenade. and shouted, Shema Yisrael. Today, I want to turn to a hero of a very different sort, a Beryl Katzenelson. Katzenelson was born January 25th, 1887 in Belarus. His father, Moshe Avram Katzenelson, was a prosperous timber merchant influenced by the Jewish Enlightenment movement. He made sure, though, that his son Beryl received a firm grounding in Judaism and the Hebrew language. And Beryl, from a very young age, dreamed of making Aliyah. At age 22, still in Belarus, he taught in an all-girls Jewish school, and he worked in a Jewish library. Although he remained a secular Jew, as opposed to Roe Klein, his entire life, he retained an enduring love and respect for Jewish thought, culture, and tradition. And he sailed to Palestine in 1909. He died in 1944, short of being able to see his dream come true. But in his life, he accomplished a great deal. He helped establish the collective, the Kinneret Farm, where Rachel the poet was from, Naomi Shemer. He helped found and run major institutions of the labor Zionist movement, of which he was one of the founding intellects. He founded Clalit, the Kupat Cholim, of which I am a member, the health service, the Histadrut Labor Federation, an editor of the daily newspaper, The Davar, and Bank HaPoalim. And finally, the Am Oved Publishing House. He was a force, and his ideology demanded that the new Jew work the land, very similar to Olive Gordon. And it was important to him that Jewish farmers employ Jewish laborers. But very interesting, to bring us to the point I want to make about him, he advocated always for moderation and eschewed extremism. Now, why is this important? As I said, he was a secular Jew, but it is thanks to him that in the Israeli public space, still for the most part, not entirely, Kashrut and Shabbat are observed. And thanks to him that Jewish holidays are national holidays. Now, as a secular thinker, not many agreed with him. But as we discussed months ago with Micha Goodman, he had no need to throw out everything of the past. And Haaretz and other newspapers talk of him in this way. Beryl Katzenelson was troubled by the society he saw being created around him. He was worried that the difficulty of creating this new life would lead his comrades toward a preference for solely practical means devoid of social content. He implored his comrades to acknowledge the historical significance of their actions. What Jew would cut corners on the promises of the Nevi'im, of the prophets, or complain about the destiny of choice and redemption? Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, from Zion comes the Torah. Where is the ancient you have chosen us, the living, the burning heart, the heart-filled, the commandment that acquits and accuses? He put his secular ideologies within the context of a grander Jewish history. The question of the future for Zionism is if it will reveal and open up the popular, human-wide, and deep contents, those hidden in it from the beginning of its existence, and find the key to the heart of the people through a vision of complete redemption, a vision of freedom and humanistic Jewish sovereignty and expanse for the lives of man. For Konsta Nelson, the content that would make Zionism appealing for the masses is the high ethical standard. He cited Herzl as a pioneer of this view. Theodor Herzl, he said, understood that Jewish society needed to be not only new, but better. Interesting, when he talks about a humanistic redemption, just hit me now as I'm speaking to you. At our Seder the other night, my brother-in-law's, she's in grade 1, granddaughter, Noah, we're finished with the Seder. She's wide awake and shares with us some of her impressions of the story of the Exodus. And she used, for her first grader, she's speaking in Hebrew, she said, Bnei Yisrael, B'kochot Elohim, the Israelites, due to the strength of God, were saved. That's quite an expression for a first grader. But I think of it now because philosophers, commentators do distinguish between the exodus of Mitzrayim, Egypt, and the independence that we will be celebrating soon of modern Israel. And the distinction is, it is a miracle, but as we will say in a few minutes also, God kind of takes a back seat now, wanting, as we've said in other contexts, the human input, the human input. Now, we remember that Konsta Nelson was a secular. I'm sure you've heard of Tel Chai. Up north, Yosef Trumpeldor, and in 1920, 28 were killed in battle. And Konsta Nelson felt the need to create, despite his secularism, a type of poem or prayer. And he took it based on earlier Yizkors for relatives. And he built it upon that traditional prayer. And in this Yizkor, he makes it very particular to the individuals that were lost there. Now, I say that because since then, there have been several versions and changes made in the Yizkor for Yom HaZikaron, for fallen soldiers of Israel. First of all, one change has to do with the fact that at one time it was just for the soldiers of Milchemet HaShichur, the War of Independence, Then they decided they should include those that have fallen in future wars. And ultimately also included are victims of terrorist attacks. So that's one type of change. Now, something very, very interesting. You see this version of Yizkor, Yizkor Am Yisrael. Keep that in mind. May Am Yisrael remember his sons and daughters who exposed themselves to mortal danger in those days of struggle prior to the establishment of the state of Israel. And may he remember the Am, soldiers of the Israeli Defense Forces who fell in the wars of Israel. May the people of Israel keep them in their memory and blessed with their seed. Let them mourn the splendor of youth, the charm of valor, the holiness of will, and the devotion of sacrifice, which came to an end in the heavy battles. May the loyal and valiant heroes of freedom and victory be sealed forever within the hearts of Israel. Now, I want you to note differences between this Yizkor, which is recited at Har Herzl on Yom HaZikaron, and this Yizkor, which some choose to recite. And then I'm going to involve you in a discussion, a tension that has existed here regarding these Yizkors. So try to be on the lookout for differences. Yizkor Elohim. May God remember the souls of his heroic children, the fighters of the Israel Defense Forces who fell in the wars of Israel in defensive, retaliative, and security actions and during the fulfillment of their duty, including the souls of the underground fighters and brigades who fought in the national struggle, all those who sacrificed their lives for the sanctification of God's name. And with the help of God, the Lord of Israel's campaigns, they brought about the revival of the nation and the state and the redemption of the land and the city of God. They were quicker than eagles and stronger than lions as they volunteered to assist the nation, and they saturated our holy land with their pure blood. The memory of their self-sacrifice and heroic deeds will never disappear from us. May their souls be bound in the bond of life with the souls of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and with the souls of the other heroes and martyrs of Israel who are in the Garden of Eden. Amen. So, what are some differences there? One key difference.
The inclusion of God.
Exactly. Okay? God's name is mentioned here, and dying al Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of God's name, the city of God. Okay, now I want you to keep both of these versions in mind as I read to you a letter that was written in the same time as Roe Klein by Sergeant Gadi Ezra. And he's writing to his fiancée, Galit Meislik. And as I'm reading it, I want you to think, which Yizkor do you think he would prefer? Dear Galiti, If you receive this letter, it is a sign that something has happened to me. This morning, we received the news that the military operation that was planned for yesterday will take place with God's help today. I told you that the operation had changed and that it was different than the one originally planned. I told you this, dearest, because I did not want to worry you. It was very hard for me to not tell you the truth, but I preferred this than to cause you worry. The Gemara says, one may distort the facts for the sake of peace. Also, the inner peace of someone you love more than anything on earth. My beloved, on one hand, I feel that there is nothing more than I want than to be with you, to love you and to establish with you a home and a family. But on the other hand, there isn't anything that I would want more than to participate in this military operation and strike those terrorists a blow so strong they will never again even consider carrying out a terrorist attack. To do this, there is a price that we must pay, and I am willing to be this price. Don't be angry with me, my love, but at moments like this, your feelings for Klal Yisrael are supposed to guide you. And you must relate to this evil as if your private life does not exist. In fact, men in King David's army divorced their wives before going off to war. My beautiful one, my only distress is that you will be sorry and that I will not be the one who will make you happy. Because there isn't anything in the world you deserve more. I therefore request, my beloved, that you should be happy, that you will be joyful, that you will love, and that you will blossom, because that is what you deserve. I will always watch over you, and I will make sure that you will meet the man who will give you more happiness than I have given you. My darling, everything that happens is ultimately for the best. And if this is the will of the Almighty, then that's the way it has to be. What is left for us is to accept it with love. I want you to know that you will be my last thought at that moment. And I will leave this world with the knowledge that I was the happiest person I possibly could be due to you. I thank you for all the good and happiness you have inspired me with when we were together. It is not that we were together, but we were always together. We were together before we came into this world, and we are also together when we separate from it. Remember this, my dearest. We are always, always together because the root of our souls is one. Please spread this message, my dearest. Don't despair. Be always happy. This is what I request of you, even if it is difficult. I know that I am able to ask this of you because I know the natural happiness and joy that shines from within you always. It is your joy and happiness which I so much love in you. Gadi. So I'm going to add another question. You're Galit, and you just read this. What do you think her immediate reaction would be?
It's a two-edged sword. She's fortunate to have had such great love, but with it, she realizes how big the loss is.
Yafet. Anybody else? Is she at that moment going to be rational enough to think of what she might eventually think that Esther suggested? Anybody? And don't fear saying something that you might think should not be said. I guess, yeah.
Bracha, I think she would be angry.
Okay, Brenda. There, Brenda's got guts.
Yeah, I think, you know, because first of all, like, I mean, angry at the situation that's taking him away, and angry that despite his declaration of great love, she's not the first priority.
Okay.
But
okay.
You know, Bracha, I speak from personal experience. When my husband died, when we were in the hospital, he grabbed my hand and he said, "Sweetheart, you're incredible." And that was it. So originally I was beside myself because it was a terrible loss. But then later, when I remember these last words, it gave me so much comfort.
Absolutely. And thank God for that. But I think what Brenda's pointing to is that here you have this young man who has the rest of his and her life ahead of them, and he is making what comes down to a choice. Now, anybody else before I go on?
I think this is all very powerful. I lost my wife 8 years ago. We got married in Toronto. I live in Cleveland, Ohio. And I think we would have given our last breath for each other. And she told me when she was very ill, she wanted to stay on just to take care of me. She was kind of motherly, but I know she would speak as he did. She had an unshakable belief in God, but she would want me to be happy.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. Now, again, the circumstances are different here because he, well, yes or no, could have chosen. There's always a choice you can make, leave and not be part of this. But he does make that choice. Now, it is possible, as Roee Klein's wife, if you watch interviews, of course, she could have been angry as well and upset, but that she clearly appreciated what he did. And I would tend to think that Galit, if she was somebody with Gadi, would also come to appreciate that. But of course, she would have the right to an immediate screaming, weeping of mourning. Now, my second question, though, which of those two Yizkors, the one that is considered the Chiloni, the secular, the first, may the Hebrew nation remember, or Am Yisrael, as opposed to may God remember? Which of those do you think somebody like Gadi, maybe even Roee, would want recited?
But I think the one with God includes the other part too.
Okay. Anybody else?
I would think that he would want the second one. Just judging from his introduction to the letter to Galit, where he mentions right up top, he mentions God and God's hand in what's going to happen. And he also mentions Gemara. So you know that he's steeped in a certain tradition and therefore would want the second one.
Okay, Marlene. Everybody agree with Marlene?
I do.
Yes? No, I see somebody shaking her head no. I'm not going to say your name in case you don't want to, but if you'd like, please share why you think no. No, okay. Nobody? Absolutely nobody? Because it would be too simple of me to ask that question if it clearly, without a doubt, and I don't know for sure, was the second, because it does, for the very reasons that Marlene gave, that he's somebody who has internalized belief in God. He sounds like a God-fearing person, and the first doesn't even mention God. Okay, Frida.
Talking about the first one, I find the second one too many words, just way too long. And when you're reading the first one, you can just stop at each kind of person that died, and you can think about all that. And it's not so long in wording. I just find it way too long.
No, and there is something about something being too long, and that is another issue. But there is something about what you said, and that's what we're meant to do. Now, it's interesting that you say that, because clearly when you're reading a Yizkor for a person that you're close with, we're close with, and you know, you are going to be thinking about that person. Here, there isn't anybody in this country that won't know somebody who is in one of the military cemeteries, so that you might not actually know the person, but you know a relative. And so you're thinking not just of a particular person, but you're thinking, as Gadi says here, Klal Yisrael, the entire Jewish people. That's also a concern of his. Now, you remember in the beginning of our hour, I mentioned the mosaic of the diversity of the citizens of this country. And for our purposes now, we'll divide between those who would support the Chiloni, the secular version, and those, the more traditional, with God's name. And it isn't absolutely to be said that the traditional would obviously want God's name. It's not that he doesn't want God's name, but maybe there is another concern as well. And what else happens at this ceremony besides the Yizkor Am Yisrael? After that is said El Malei Rachamim, where God is mentioned, and Kaddish, where God is mentioned. So I'm hinting already at a compromise. Now, I'd like us to look at a few perspectives on this issue. So Cardozo here is very concerned about, like Katzenelson, Israel, modern Israel, maintaining its sense of Jewishness. Israel is summoned to remind the world of God's existence, not only concerning religion, but also as a historical reality. There is no security for Israel unless it is secure in its own destiny. We must shoulder the burden of our own singularity, which means nothing less than fulfilling our role as God's witness. Israel's very existence is the manifestation of divine intervention in history to which it must attest. So we're hearing his traditionalism and seeing this perhaps very similar to God's role in the Exodus. In Israel, history and revelation are one. Only there do they coincide. While other nations exist as nations, the people of Israel exist as a reminder of God's involvement in world history. Only through Israel is humanity touched by the divine. So this Cardozo, yes, definitely is an advocate for the more traditional Yizkor. Now, there wasn't a translation of this, so I'm going to share it with you. In 2011, there was a suggestion that we go back to Yizkor Elohim. May God remember. And Yehudit Bieler, whose son died in 1969 in the War of Attrition against the forces of Egypt in the Suez Canal, Yoram, her son, was 21. And she says, he knew that he was protecting his homeland. It is important for me, as she says this, a reaction to the suggestion that we're going to go back to Yizkor Elohim. It's important for me to know that the nation to which he belonged and loved will remember. She's putting the burden of memory on all of us, not God. Me, Yoram, we don't have connections with Elohim, God. Therefore, I am strongly opposed to changing the version from Yizkor Am Yisrael. And she turned to other bereaved parents, and she had over 66,000 signatures on a petition. Now, interestingly, when this was brought up and it was looked into, the powers that be became aware that some institutions were saying Yizkor Am Yisrael, and others were following Shlomo Goren. You remember Rav Shlomo Goren of the 67 war, who was the chief rabbi. He had said, it's got to have God's name. And so there wasn't a unified. And there's something wrong with that. It was summed up when you're talking about comrades in war, no matter what their ideological differences, that you should differentiate between a prayer that's being said in their honor and in their memory. To think about. Evelyn Gordon is a journalist who had made Aliyah, and her response to this suggestion is, this clearly is ridiculous, because in the news items, they also said, the military is now going to be a theocracy. Yizkor Elohim is simply the traditional Jewish memorial prayer, the one that even secular Jews recite in memory of their loved ones. For instance, if they attend synagogue on Yom Kippur, they do so not because they believe in God, but because they see themselves as part of the Jewish people. And Yizkor is the traditional way for Jews to remember the dead. That is also why most secular Jews do recite the Kaddish prayer, whose opening line is, magnified and sanctified be his, God's great name, at a relative's funeral, not because they believe in God and want to sanctify his name, but because they are Jews. And this is part of the traditional Jewish burial ceremony. So she is for the traditional. Now, a modern rabbi writes the following: I want to turn to the religious people who are applying pressure and tell them, thousands of secular people stand during the Memorial Day ceremonies and give respect to the religious prayer offered after Yizkor. Some of them do not believe in God and do not identify with the words of the prayer, but they respect the occasion. They can identify with one phrase, and it's in the Yizkor prayer. May the people of Israel remember. How dare you take away this small thing? In brutally eradicating the phrase, you have sown discord of all times on Memorial Day. The fact that you replace the people of Israel with the name of God does not strengthen the bond to tradition. On the contrary, it weakens it. You are forcing an entire group of people in Israel into separate ceremonies in which naturally and in response to your lack of consideration, the traditional prayers will not be accepted with respectful silence. And one final from a secular Moshe Shartov. Who did our soldiers die for? The people and the state. If religious persons go into the army for religious reasons, or make aliyah for that matter, I'm happy for them. However, that's not the case for all Israelis, and not even for all religious Jews in the army. I served 22 years of regular and reserve service, and my two sons are currently in uniform, one in regular and the other in the reserves, miluim. None of us went to serve God or the religion, but to serve the state of Israel and the people who live in it. I know there are many like us, and our service must not be compromised into an orthodox version of the religion we do not believe in. Neither does the Orthodox stream represent the majority of Jews of the world, who I hope will consider joining us here one day. We are closing the doors on such individuals who are willing to serve and those who would otherwise consider making their futures here with us. So, my friends, I'm not convinced that Gadi would not realize the significance of May Am Yisrael Yizkor. Unfortunately, we won't know for sure. The second mosaic, new and yet old. Some interesting points about these modern symbols. And take note, you'll see how it, again, is based on the traditional. At the Zionist Congress in Basel, Herzl raised the question of what form a flag for the new Jewish state would be. As delegates discussed the matter, one German Jewish Zionist named David Wolfson stood up and captivated the attention of all the delegates. David Wolfson was born into a traditional Jewish family in Lithuania in 1856. He eventually moved to the German city of Cologne and became a successful businessman and worked tirelessly to help build a Jewish state and to aid his fellow Jews. At the first Zionist Congress, as delegates around the world debated the flag, Wolfson is said to have stood up, pulled out his talit, his Jewish prayer shawl, and asked, "Why do we have to search? Here is our national flag," and waved his talit with its two blue stripes on a white background to the assembled crowd. Soon, the familiar blue and white stripes framing a Jewish star became the official flag of the Zionist movement. Now, the Jewish Agency describes this flag. The flag's two blue horizontal stripes remind us of the talit, in which Jewish men wrap themselves when they pray. I'm sure they've made an addendum now that there are Jewish women as well. This reminds us of the faith and prayers of the many generations of Jews who continually longed for their homeland. The shield of David, Magen David, between the stripes, is a traditional symbol of Judaism. It comprises two triangles, and I love the metaphor here, one pointing up toward all that is spiritual and holy, and the other pointing down toward all that is earthly and secular. The Jews of the state of Israel thus symbolically strive to bring together the spiritual and earthly worlds, the holy and secular. Why not? How can you oppose that? And the Magen David, it is said that David, a great king of Israel, adorned his shield with this symbol, which is where it got its name. The 6 points of the star symbolize God's rule over the universe in all 6 directions, north, south, east, west, up and down. Originally, the Hebrew name Magen David poetically referred to God. It acknowledges that our military King David did not win by his own might, but by the support of the Almighty. Now, here you can see it as God helping him, or you might just see it in the same way that some Israelis look at the Maccabees as being totally responsible. Now, the Israeli emblem. The emblem tells the story of the country's history, people and land. It shows the menorah from the Holy Jewish Temple. It reminds us, I'm skipping a few things, it reminds us of the journey of the Jewish people from exile after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim to return in modern times with the reestablishment of the state of Israel, almost 2,000 later, symbolically. The menorah removed from the temple about 1900 years ago and paraded triumphantly throughout Rome has returned to Jerusalem and Israel, restored to its former glory. And the olive branches represent the vision of Zechariah, of peace. And the menorah, again, originated as a 7-branched candelabrum carried by the Israelites through the Sinai desert. It is today the emblem of the modern state of Israel. Now, like the Iskar, there were a few options for Hatikva. It's based on a very, very lengthy poem that certainly Frida would not have liked as the anthem, called Tikvatenu, Our Hope. And I want you to note some differences here as well. So this is the one that we uphold. The Jewish soul yearns, and toward the eastern edges onward. As long as in the heart within, the Jewish soul yearns, and toward the eastern edges onward, and eye gazes toward Zion. The hope, our hope is not yet lost. The hope that is 2,000 years old to be a free nation on our land, the land of Zion, Jerusalem. Now, the original, our hope is not yet lost, the ancient hope to return to the land of our fathers. So already a difference. The city where David encamped, as long as in his heart, within, a soul of a Jew still yearns, and onwards toward the end of the east, his eye still looks toward Zion. As long as tears from our eyes flow like benevolent rain, and throngs of our countrymen still pay homage at the graves of our fathers. As long as our precious Kotel appears before our eyes, and over the destruction of our temple, and eye still wells up with tears. As long as the feeling of love of nation throbs in the heart of a Jew, we can still hope even today that a wrathful God may have mercy on us. Rather big changes in Hatikva. Now, final symbol, which isn't actually a symbol, but the story of the Declaration of Independence. May 14th, 1948, a Friday. There is no agreement on the text. Some want what word in there? God. And others no. And they are at odds with each other. But Shabbat is coming. The US is putting pressure, and they're afraid already of the war that's going to break out. And finally, they come to an agreement. The Bible insists that the human role in redemption in no way reduces the divine intentionality and responsibility for the outcome of events. This is implicit in the meaning of covenant. In the case of the state of Israel, however, the human role in redemption is dominant and self-assertive. And so the declaration has to reflect that. This secularism, though, should not be confused with atheism or celebration of the death of God. In this new era, post-Shoah, God becomes even more hidden. The circumstances of redemption even more ambiguous. This ambiguity serves a twofold function. It allows those who prefer to interpret the activity as purely secular to do so, and it permits the religious soul to recognize the divine role out of mature understanding and free will rather than out of coerced yielding to divine force majeure. So what was the compromise that everyone agreed upon? Instead of God, what does it say? With trust in the rock of Israel. Now, what's the word in Hebrew for rock?
So,
there's Evan, but there's
Sur.
also
Sur.
Sur.
So
Now, in Hebrew, there are no uppercase, lowercase letters. So this was perfect. The secular feel the rock is the people. And the religious know that it's Sur with a capital R, Sur with a capital R, and they are thinking of God. And that is what it says. One final thought. Next week, this song, Shir HaReut, Song of Friendship, will be heard over and over again. It was written by Chaim Guri, Zichrono Livracha, after the 48 war. And why do I write faith, ? Friendship? Who's to say, is it just faith in God? That's the type of faith. The autumn night descends upon the Negev and silently kindles the stars. As the wind passes over the threshold, clouds proceed on their way. A year has already gone by and we have hardly noticed how time has passed in our fields. Already a year, and only a few of us remain. Oh, how many are no longer with us, but we will remember them all. The beauty of their forelock, blorit, and figure. For friendship such as this will never let our hearts forget. O love sanctified in blood, you shall return to flourish among us. O friendship, we bore you without words, gloomy, stubborn, and silent. From those great nights of terror, you remain bright and luminescent. O friendship, like all your youths, in your name we shall again smile and go forward. For those friends who fell on their swords, left behind your life in memory. But we will remember them all, the beauty of their forelock, blorit, and figure. For friendship such as this will never let our hearts forget. O love sanctified in blood, you shall return to flourish among us. What is this image of the blorit, the forelock? Can you picture what that is? It's like if I go with my hair, like in those days, in the late 40s and 50s, guys would have a hair sticking out like that, a tuft of hair. And what was that meant to symbolize? It was an essential part of that generation, a sign of rugged beauty, rebelliousness against traditional authority.
And in the Golad, in the camps, they were all shaved.
Okay, yafeh, beautiful. And also on that same note, a rebelliousness also against the authority and the call to wear a kippah. This song reflects, epitomizes really the values of these friends who are willing to give up their lives for each other and who will never forget each other. Epitomizes their values and the values of the War of Independence, the physical beauty, the prowess of the soldier, in contrast to the learnedness prized by Jewish culture. This was all still very new. But what kept these going were the unshakable bonds of friendship. And to close, a word from Avram Yoshua Heschel. To us, recollection is a holy act. We sanctify the present by remembering the past. To us Jews, the essence of faith is memory. To believe is to remember. Jewish memory has not become a collection of frozen remains. Its vitality is retained in the strength of hope and the imagination which have surpassed the borders of faith. What appears unbelievable has become a clear conclusion.
Bracha, just something that you mentioned in the beginning of the talk, how all the holidays became national holidays. And when I came from Israel to Canada, I noticed more people going to synagogue in Montreal than they did in Israel, because there was no question of identity. The holidays and everything around us gave us the identity. Here, there was the need for it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? I am aware today I let you speak just a little more than last week, but I decided I wanted to do what I did last week, and I was equally touched. But that had nothing to do with me not wanting to hear your thoughts.
This was great. I really enjoyed it. Amazing. I now have to go back and listen to last week because I was on the plane last week.
Excuses, Frida. Okay.
Anyway, Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. I just wanted to add, it really is a very special time, especially here in Israel, with everything that I've discussed. And perhaps another tradition called Shabbat Tkuma, which is the Shabbat before Yom HaZikaron, means the Shabbat of rebirth, of reestablishment. And as we're still in Pesach, we're remembering the ancient rebirth. And that's certainly what this is all about. And again, to go back to how I opened with the Kohelet statement, there have been debates about the proximity of Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaAtzmaut, even though the man I described at Har Herzl and Gan Sacher, who realized the essence of them being so close, there are some who feel the people who are bereaved. And that's even if your child or your father or your brother or your husband or your wife died 30 years ago. How can you so quickly go from such sadness to joy that they don't really get to appreciate the joy? But it's been decided the two have to go together. Just as we heard earlier, that's our lot in life, that we have to be able to learn, I don't know if I should say make the most of each of those moods or know how to balance them, because we're never free of one and hopefully not free of the other. So, in respect to Yom HaShoah, which will be on Wednesday night here, and in celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut, we will not be meeting for the next 2 weeks, but we will after that, as we look toward yet another holiday, Shavuot. So enjoy the rest of Pesach. And Elliot, thank you for, I see your name now, joining us.
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned, my wife was from Toronto, so it's kind of like my second city. There are a lot of connections between Cleveland, Ohio, and Toronto, and I'm looking forward to going up there again, crossing the border if they'll let me in.
Okay, amen.
Excellent class, superb. As I think about this, I'd just like to make one final comment. I know people have good intentions, but when it comes to at a Shiva call and people go around and rattle off those words, may you arrive at comfort like those among Israel, whatever. I think that in some ways can be hurtful, especially if it's just rattled off as a mechanical utterance, a mantra, rather than something that's uttered sincerely. I think a touch on the shoulder, eye contact might mean more than those words that are often rattled off.
Well,
absolutely.
I find
sincerity is very important.
I think asking the person who is mourning to tell them about the person who died, or keep quiet.
Well, you know, there is the tradition. It's sometimes uncomfortable, but when you come into a Shiva house and you go over to the mourner, you're really meant to sit quietly until he or she wants to talk, and that you take it from there. Yeah. So that you're not saying irrelevant things.
But I find if you do talk, they like you to ask them about the person.
About the person. It's a wonderful opportunity. You hear stories that you hadn't heard. Sometimes you tell them a story about the one they lost that they were not aware of. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay.
So let's go for Simcha.
Amen. Amen.
Can I make one final comment? Your readings were profound beyond words and very thought-provoking. Thank you for a wonderful class. I hope to be back.
You're very welcome. Okay. Frida, safe travels, and everybody else, please stay well.
Chag Sameach.
Thank you.
My pleasure. As always.